The Italian summer sun beat down mercilessly on the archaeological site near Pompeii, casting long shadows across the ancient stones as Dr. Claire Edwards wiped sweat from her brow. The excavation had been underway for 3 months, but today felt different. The air hung heavy with an unusual stillness, despite the constant whir of ventilation fans and the distant chorus of cicadas. Claire stood at the edge of what her team had uncovered, a massive stone structure buried far deeper than any other find in the region. The walls, still partially obscured by volcanic ash and debris, bore the unmistakable signs of Roman engineering, but something about their construction seemed off. The stones fit together with a precision that seemed almost impossible for the time period. Dr. Edwards. Elliot Carrington's voice carried across the site as he jogged toward her, his tablet computer clutched in his hands. The young digital archaeologist's usual enthusiasm was tinged with something else, excitement, yes, but also uncertainty. You need to see these scan results. Elliot's ground-penetrating radar had revealed something extraordinary, a complete Roman fort, buried far deeper than should have been possible given the known layers of Pompeii's destruction. But it wasn't just the depth that caught Claire's attention. The fortress's layout was unlike anything she'd seen in her 15 years of studying Roman military architecture. The walls, Gianluca Bianchi said softly, joining them at the edge of the excavation. The local historian's usually cheerful face was drawn with concern. Their double thickness, triple in some places. The Romans weren't building to keep people out, they were building to keep something in. Claire might have dismissed such an ominous interpretation a few months ago, but the discovery had been marked by too many peculiarities to ignore. The positioning of the fort made no tactical sense for a military installation. The reinforcement patterns suggested the Romans had been more concerned about something breaking out than attacking from outside. Serena Torres, Claire's research assistant, appeared with a stack of preliminary findings. The dating results came back, she said, her voice quiet but intense. The lowest levels of the structure. They're older than they should be, much older. The team gathered in their makeshift research tent, spreading out maps and scanning results across a large table. Marco Di Stefano, their field guide and security expert, stood at the entrance, his weathered face troubled as he listened to their findings. The fort predates the destruction of Pompeii by at least a century, Claire explained, pointing to the chronological data. But these construction techniques, some of them don't match known Roman engineering of any period. It's as if they were adapting or copying something even older. Their discussion was interrupted by a call from the excavation team. They'd broken through to a new chamber, and this one was different. Unlike the ash-filled rooms above, this space had been deliberately sealed. The door was marked with elaborate carvings, and the room beyond held something that would change everything. A collection of perfectly preserved scrolls and tablets, sealed away for nearly 2,000 years. The documents were extraordinary, written in a precise military hand that spoke of the author's education and rank. But as the team began their careful translation work, it became clear these were no ordinary military records. The Roman Centurion's reports started conventionally enough, but they quickly descended into accounts of inexplicable events and mounting dread. "Listen to this passage," Serena said, her voice trembling slightly as she read from their preliminary translation. "The men speak of sounds in the night, of shadows that move against the light of our torches. 3 more disappeared from the lower chambers yesterday. We seal those levels now, but I fear we have waited too long. The old gods my grandfather spoke of, the ones that came before Rome, before all of us, he was right. They hunger still." The sun was setting outside their tent, casting long shadows through the translucent fabric. The distant sounds of modern Pompeii seemed very far away as they continued to read. The Centurion's writings spoke of an ancient evil, something his men had been tasked with containing. The fort wasn't a military outpost. It was a prison built to hold something that terrified even Rome's most hardened soldiers. As night fell over the excavation site, the team remained hunched over their discoveries, unaware that their very presence had already set something in motion. In the deepest chamber they'd uncovered, where the air had remained still for millennia, the first breeze in 2,000 years stirred the ancient dust. And in that stirring, something that had waited patiently through the long centuries began to wake. Claire was the first to notice the change in air pressure, a subtle shift that made her ears pop. She looked up from the documents, catching Gianluca's eye. The historian had gone pale, his hand frozen in the act of turning a page. "Did anyone else feel that?" she asked. But before anyone could respond, the generators outside sputtered and died, plunging the site into darkness. In the pitch black, the first whispers began, sounds that might have been Latin, might have been something far older, echoing up from the depths of their discovery. And in that moment, they all understood that they hadn't just found a piece of history. They'd broken a seal that had kept the modern world safe from something ancient and hungry. The real horror was only beginning. In the suffocating darkness, Marco's flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating faces frozen in various states of alarm. The backup generators should have kicked in automatically, but the entire electrical system had gone dead, taking their climate control and safety systems with it. "Everyone stay calm," Marco commanded, his professional demeanor taking over. "Dr. Edwards, where's your emergency kit?" Claire fumbled in the dark, locating her field pack by touch. Inside were several chemical light sticks, which cast an eerie green glow across the research tent as she activated them. In that sickly illumination, the ancient documents seemed to take on a different character, the carefully preserved Latin text appearing to shift and move in ways that defied explanation. "We need to secure the site," Claire said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "If the power failure compromises the climate control in the document storage." A sound cut through the night air, silencing her mid-sentence. It was like distant singing, but not in any language any of them recognized. The melody, if it could be called that, seemed to crawl through their minds, leaving behind impressions of vast, dark spaces and ancient, forgotten things. "That's coming from the fort," Elliot whispered, his face ghostly in the chemical light. "From the lower chambers." Serena grabbed Claire's arm, her fingers digging in with unexpected strength. "The documents," she said urgently. "The Centurion wrote about this, about songs in the dark, about how they started hearing them just before." A violent tremor shook the ground, sending equipment crashing to the floor. As papers scattered across the tent, Gianluca lunged to protect the ancient documents, but froze halfway through the motion. His eyes were fixed on one of the fallen pages, where the ink seemed to be moving of its own accord. "Impossible," he breathed, but they all saw it. The carefully preserved Latin text was changing, the ancient words rearranging themselves before their eyes. As they watched, new words formed. "Liberatum est," it is freed. Marco was already moving toward the tent's entrance, his security training evident in every motion. "We need to evacuate. Now, whatever's happening here." His words cut off as another tremor rocked the site, this one strong enough to split the ground near the fort's entrance. From the fissure came a blast of stale air that carried the weight of millennia. The smell was indescribable, not the usual musty scent of archaeological sites, but something older, something that spoke of decay and things that should have remained buried. "The seals," Gianluca said, his voice shaking. "The fort wasn't just built to contain something. The entire structure is one massive seal, designed to keep whatever's down there locked away. And we've just broken it." As if in response to his words, a low moan echoed from the excavated chambers. It was a sound that should not have been possible, a noise that spoke of awareness and hunger and ancient patience finally rewarded. The chemical lights flickered, their green glow dimming as if something was feeding on their illumination. "The Centurion's last entries," Serena said, her voice barely a whisper. "He wrote about how it started. The darkness came first, then the sounds. Then people began to disappear." She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "But he wrote something else too, about bloodlines, about how certain families were chosen to maintain the seals, about..." She stopped suddenly, swaying on her feet. In the dim light, her face had gone ash white, and a trickle of blood ran from her nose. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, taking on a resonance that seemed to echo from somewhere deep underground. They knew, she said, but it wasn't quite Serena speaking anymore. The Romans knew what slept here, what had always slept here. They thought their walls and their rituals could contain us forever. But time is nothing to us. We are patience, we are hunger, and now... Serena's eyes rolled back, and she would have collapsed if Claire hadn't caught her. As the young researcher fell unconscious, another tremor shook the site, and in the darkness beyond their failing lights, something moved. Something massive, something that had waited thousands of years for this moment. The horror they had discovered was no longer content to remain in the depths. It was rising, awakening, and they were all that stood between it and a world that had forgotten such things ever existed. Claire pressed her fingers against Serena's neck, checking her pulse. She's alive, but her skin is ice cold. She looked up at the others, their faces painted in shadow by the dying chemical lights. We need to get her out of here. The road's blocked, Marco said, returning from his quick survey outside. His face was grim. The tremors caused a landslide. No vehicles can get through until it's cleared. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the unnatural chill in the air. And the radio's dead. Cell phones too. It's like something's blocking all signals. Gianluca had retrieved more of the scattered documents, his hands trembling as he read. There's more here, about what happened to the fort's original garrison, the Centurion. He wrote about how it started affecting people. Those with certain bloodlines were more susceptible. It could reach into their minds, use them as vessels. A low moan escaped Serena's lips, her body twitching. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were different now, the whites completely black, like pools of ink. When she spoke, her voice echoed with undertones that made their teeth ache. The seal is broken, she said, the words ancient and cold. The bargain is ended. What was bound will be bound no longer. Her hand shot out, grabbing Claire's wrist with impossible strength. Your kind forgot us, forgot the price of the Pax Romana. Rome built its empire on our backs, sealed us away, but they promised to maintain the seals, to keep the bloodlines pure, to remember, but you forgot. You all forgot. Elliot had been frantically working with his tablet, trying to salvage data from their scans. Dr. Edwards, he called, his voice cracking. The fort structure, it's changing. The walls aren't just shaking, they're transforming. The stone itself is becoming something else. As if to confirm his words, a grinding sound echoed from the excavation site. The exposed walls of the fort were darkening, the ancient stone taking on an oily, organic quality. Veins of phosphorescent light began to pulse through the rock, creating patterns that hurt the eyes to look at. We need to complete the binding ritual, Gianluca said suddenly, rifling through the documents with increasing urgency. The Centurion's last entries. He wasn't just recording what happened. He was leaving instructions, a failsafe in case the seals were ever broken. A ritual, Marco scoffed, but his skepticism sounded hollow in the face of what they were witnessing. This is insane. We need to focus on getting help. His words cut off as Serena began to convulse, her body arching unnaturally. The blackness in her eyes was spreading, dark veins spreading across her face like cracks in marble. When she screamed, the sound was both her voice and something else's, something that had no right existing in their world. The blood remembers, she gasped between spasms. The blood remembers everything. Her hand clutched at her chest, where a strange symbol was beginning to appear through her shirt, glowing with the same sickly light as the fort's walls. Claire made a decision. Gianluca, find those instructions. Elliot, get everything you can from our scans. We need to understand what's happening to the structure. Marco, she looked at their security expert, who was already checking his gear. We need to find a way to contact the outside world. Someone must know about this. Someone must have records of what the Romans were really doing here. The ground shook again, and from the depths of the fort came a sound that should not have been possible. Vast and hungry and aware, the chemical lights finally died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the pulsing veins of light from the excavation. In that terrible illumination, they saw shapes moving in the shadows, things that defied description, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than their minds could process. And through it all, Serena's voice kept speaking, but it was less and less her own. We are the forgotten ones, the ones that dwelt in darkness while your kind crawled from the mud. Rome thought they could bind us, use us, control us, but they only delayed the inevitable. We are eternal, we are patient, and now we are awake. The horror was no longer content to remain in the shadows. It was rising, taking form, reaching out through the bloodlines it had waited so long to reclaim. And as the team huddled in their failing sanctuary, they realized that the real nightmare was only beginning. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for a world that had no idea what horrors the ancient Romans had locked away in their forgotten forts. The next few hours would determine whether those horrors remained forgotten, or whether they would reclaim a world that had once been theirs. Gianluca's hands shook as he pieced together the fragments of the Centurion's final instructions. The ancient parchment felt alive beneath his fingers, pulsing with the same sickly light that now infected the fort's walls. "The ritual," he muttered, translating as quickly as he could. "It requires 5 elements. Blood of the bloodline, which we have through Serena, sacred water from the old springs beneath Pompeii, iron from Roman weapons forged in traditional fire, salt from the Mediterranean, and," he paused, his face paling, "the sacrifice of one who bears the mark." As if in response to his words, the symbol on Serena's chest flared brighter. She had stopped convulsing, but now sat unnaturally still, her black eyes fixed on something none of them could see. The darkness in her veins had spread further, creating intricate patterns across her skin that mirrored the ancient carvings they'd found in the fort's deepest chambers. "No," Claire said firmly, understanding the implication. "We're not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another way." The ruins groaned around them and the temperature dropped further. Their breath came out in visible clouds despite the summer heat outside. The pulsing veins of light in the walls had spread, creating a network of illuminated channels that seemed to be flowing toward a central point deep within the fort. Elliot's tablet flickered to life unexpectedly, its screen displaying impossible data. "The energy readings are off the scale," he reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Whatever's happening to the fort, it's not just changing the structure, it's creating something, like the whole building is becoming a massive organic machine." A horrible laugh echoed from Serena's lips, a sound that contained multitudes of voices, all ancient, all hungry. "You cannot stop what has already begun," she said, but her voice was layered with others, speaking in languages dead for millennia. "The price must be paid, the blood must flow. As it was in the beginning, so it must be in the end." Marco had been examining the fort's entrance, where the stone had become almost liquid in appearance, rippling like the surface of a dark pond. "The changes are accelerating," he reported. "We've got maybe an hour before the whole structure is completely transformed. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Claire made a decision. "Gianluca, keep translating those instructions. Every detail matters. Elliot, use your equipment to map out these energy flows. If this is becoming a machine, it must have a center, a heart we can target." "Marco," she paused, looking at their security expert. "We need those ritual components, the spring water, the iron, the salt. There's an old armory section we uncovered last week and the ancient coastline wasn't far from here." But as they began to move, Serena stood up with unnatural fluidity. The darkness in her eyes had spread to the air around her, creating a void that light itself seemed to avoid. "You still don't understand," she said, her voice resonating with power that made the ground tremble. "We are not some evil to be banished. We are the original inheritors of this world. Your kind were nothing before Rome found us, bargained with us, betrayed us. We gave them empire, and they gave us prison. No more." The air itself seemed to twist around her, and for a moment, they caught glimpses of something vast and impossible occupying the same space as her human form. A presence that extended beyond the dimensions they could perceive. The shadows around her took on substance, forming tentacles of pure darkness that reached out with terrible purpose. Then Marco did something none of them expected. He rushed forward, tackling Serena to the ground. The darkness recoiled, surprised by the sudden physical assault, but Marco wasn't trying to hurt her. Instead, he pressed something into her hand, a small iron coin he'd found in the ruins earlier that day. The reaction was immediate and violent. Where the ancient iron touched her skin, the darkness recoiled. Serena screamed, a sound of both pain and fury, and the coin began to glow with a light that seemed to push back the shadows. Iron, Gianluca breathed, understanding dawning in his eyes. Not just any iron. Roman iron, blessed by their priests, forged with their prayers. They didn't just build a prison of stone. Every nail, every bracket, every piece of metal in this fort was made to contain power. Claire stared at the fort's entrance, where the stone continued its horrifying transformation. "We don't need to perform the original ritual," she said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "We just need to understand it. The Romans found a way to bind these entities into service, if we can understand how." But before she could finish her thought, a massive tremor shook the entire site. The transformed stone of the fort pulsed like a massive heart, and from deep below came a sound like the world itself breaking open. The original horror was no longer content to work through Serena alone. It was coming, rising from depths unimaginable, and bringing with it knowledge of things never meant for human minds. The transformed walls of the fort began to pulse faster, like an enormous heart gathering strength. Streams of that sickly luminescence converged on the central chamber, where the stone floor had become a swirling vortex of darkness. The air grew thick with an electric charge that made their hair stand on end, and left the taste of copper on their tongues. Serena's body rose from the ground, suspended by writhing tendrils of shadow. The iron coin had left a burning mark on her palm, and around that mark her skin remained human, a small island of normalcy in the darkness that had nearly consumed her. When she spoke again, her voice was a chorus of ancient beings, each word reverberating with centuries of patient malice. "Your iron trinkets cannot save you," the voices said through her. "Rome's power came from us. Their empire was built on our strength. Their greatest achievements were pale imitations of our ancient glory. And now, after millennia of imprisonment, we will show you what true power looks like." The darkness around her expanded, filling the chamber with shifting shadows that seemed to absorb all light. Within those shadows, shapes moved. Things that defied description, fragments of beings that existed in geometries the human mind was never meant to comprehend. But Claire noticed something crucial. The iron coin's effect hadn't faded. If anything, the mark it left seemed to be spreading, creating a web of normal human flesh that fought against the entity's corruption. She caught Gianluca's eye and saw he'd noticed it too. "The documents," she said urgently. "The Romans didn't just bind these things with iron. They must have found a way to turn their power back on itself. Look at how the mark spreads. It's like an infection, but in reverse." Elliot's tablet suddenly sparked to life, its screen filling with rapidly scrolling data. "The energy patterns," he said, his voice tight with discovery. "They're not random. They're forming a lattice, a structure that mirrors ancient Roman architecture. But it's more than that. It's like the fort itself is becoming a massive circuit, channeling power towards something." Marco had been gathering the scattered documents, and now he held up a page covered in architectural drawings. "Look at this," he said. "The fort's layout. It's not just military design. The whole structure is one giant binding circle. Every wall, every room, positioned to create a pattern of power." But before they could process this revelation, Serena's body convulsed again. The darkness within her surged, and her voice came out as a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. "Enough, your time ends now. The seal is broken, the bargain is void. What was bound will be bound no longer." The vortex in the floor exploded upward, a column of pure darkness that pierced the night sky. Within it, something began to take form, a vast, ancient presence that had waited countless centuries for this moment. The air itself seemed to crack under the pressure of its manifestation, reality straining to contain something that had existed before reality had solid form. But Claire wasn't watching the horror emerging from the depths. Her eyes were fixed on the walls, where the pulsing veins of light had begun to form familiar patterns. "The fort," she breathed. "It's not transforming randomly. It's recreating the original binding circle, but on a massive scale. The Romans didn't just build a prison. They built a machine that could remake itself if the seals were ever broken." Gianluca was frantically scanning the Centurion's final notes. Here, he shouted over the growing chaos. The ritual components, they were never meant for a human sacrifice. The blood of the bloodline, the blessed iron, the salt and water, they're not ingredients. They're keys to activate the fort's true purpose. The ground shook violently as the entity continued to manifest, its form growing more solid with each passing second. The darkness around Serena began to pulse in sync with the fort's transforming walls, and in that synchronization, Claire saw their last chance. "Marco, the iron coin," she shouted. "And everything else we gathered, bring them here. Elliot, keep tracking those energy patterns. Gianluca," she grabbed the historian's arm, "find anything else about the activation sequence. The Romans left us the tools, we just need to understand how to use them." As the team scrambled to action, the entity's manifestation reached a terrifying new phase. The darkness had taken on a form that towered above them, a presence that blotted out the stars themselves. Within its massive form, they caught glimpses of cities that had crumbled to dust before Rome was founded, civilizations that had risen and fallen in cycles beyond human understanding. And through it all, Serena's body remained suspended between earth and sky, a conduit for powers that threatened to tear reality apart. But the mark from the iron coin continued to spread across her skin, fighting back the corruption with the same dedication that had driven the Romans to build their hidden fortress. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, to understand and activate the fort's true purpose. If they failed, the horror would be fully manifest, unleashed upon a world that had forgotten such dangers ever existed. But if they succeeded, if they could unlock the secret of Rome's greatest achievement, they might just save not only Serena, but the very fabric of reality itself. Claire's mind raced as she assembled the pieces of the puzzle. The fort's transformation wasn't a sign of their failure, it was the key to their salvation. Every shifting stone, every pulsing vein of light was part of an ancient machine designed to contain powers beyond human comprehension. "The components," she shouted over the growing maelstrom. "Place them at the cardinal points." The Romans were master architects. They would have built this to align with the stars themselves. Marco moved with military precision, placing the blessed iron in the north, the Mediterranean salt in the south, the sacred spring water in the east. But as he moved to place the final component in the west, a tendril of darkness lashed out, wrapping around his throat with crushing force. "You understand nothing." The entity spoke through Serena, its voice shaking the very foundations of the fort. "Your Roman masters barely glimpsed our true nature. We are the forgotten ones, the ancient powers that shaped this world before your kind learned to kindle fire. We cannot be bound by your pitiful magics again." The darkness surrounding Serena began to pulse with increasing intensity, each beat sending waves of primordial energy through the chamber. The walls of the fort responded, their transformation accelerating until the entire structure seemed to breathe with eldritch life. But Elliot hadn't stopped studying the energy patterns on his tablet. "The pulses," he called out, his voice strained but determined. "They're not random. They're following the same pattern as ancient Roman war drums. The Romans didn't just build a prison, they built a resonance chamber. The whole fort is designed to amplify and redirect power." Gianluca's eyes widened as he deciphered more of the Centurion's final notes. He's right. The binding wasn't just about containment. The Romans found a way to turn these entities' own power against them. The fort doesn't just trap them, it transforms their energy into the very thing that holds them. Claire looked at Serena, still suspended in the air, the mark from the iron coin continuing its slow spread across her skin. The human parts of her were fighting back against the darkness, each pulse of the fort's energy strengthening her resistance. "Serena," Claire called out, "you're not just a vessel for them. Your bloodline doesn't make you their puppet. It makes you their jailer. The Romans didn't choose your ancestors by accident. They chose them because they had the strength to contain this power." For a moment, Serena's true eyes flickered through the darkness, recognition and understanding dawning in them. The entity felt it too, its massive form rippling with something that might have been concern. "Now," Claire commanded, "Marco, place the final component." Marco, still struggling against the tendril of darkness, summoned his last reserves of strength. With a mighty effort, he slammed the final ritual component into place just as another pulse of energy surged through the fort. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The veins of light in the walls flared blindingly bright, their pattern suddenly crystallizing into a perfect geometric form that encompassed the entire chamber. The entity roared, a sound of rage and desperate denial as the fort's true purpose activated. Energy coursed through the ancient stones, each pulse growing stronger, each wave of power building on the last. The darkness began to fragment, its hold on Serena weakening as the fort's power focused through her like a lens. The blood remembers, Serena spoke, but now her voice was her own, strengthened by generations of hereditary purpose. The blood remembers and the blood binds. The entity fought back with the fury of ages, its form twisting through impossible dimensions as it tried to escape the fort's power. But with each pulse, more of its essence was drawn into the geometric pattern that now filled the chamber with blinding light. The bargain is renewed, Serena continued, her voice growing stronger as the mark from the iron coin spread to cover her entirely. What was bound shall be bound again, until the stars themselves grow cold. The entity's form began to collapse in on itself, drawn inexorably into the pattern of light that the fort had become. As it was pulled in, they caught final glimpses of its true nature. Cities that had never been, civilizations that had risen and fallen before the first human walked the earth, powers that had shaped reality itself. But the fort's power was stronger, enhanced by centuries of waiting, powered by the very energy it was designed to contain. With a final, reality-shaking roar, the entity was drawn completely into the pattern. The light flared one last time, bright enough to blind, and then faded to a steady, pulsing glow that suffused the entire structure. Serena floated gently to the ground as the last of the darkness dissipated. The mark of the iron coin had spread to cover her completely, but now it began to fade, leaving behind intricate patterns like ancient tattoos that seemed to shimmer just beneath her skin. "It's done," she said softly, her voice hoarse but human. "They're bound again. The fort. It's not just a prison anymore. It's part of them, and they're part of it. A perfect circle of containment, powered by their own eternal struggle to escape." The transformed walls of the fort had solidified, the pulsing veins of light now flowing in regular, steady patterns. The air was clear again, though charged with a residual energy that spoke of powers barely contained. Claire helped Serena to her feet, noticing how the younger woman's eyes now held depths they hadn't before. Knowledge passed down through blood and bone, finally awakened to its true purpose. "What now?" Marco asked, rubbing his bruised throat as he looked at the transformed fort. "Now," Gianluca said, gathering the scattered documents with trembling hands, "we make sure this place is never forgotten again. The Romans may be gone, but their greatest achievement remains, and so do its guardians." He looked meaningfully at Serena. "The blood remembers," Serena repeated softly, touching one of the shimmering patterns on her arm. "And now, so do I." 3 months later, the excavation site had been transformed. Official reports classified it as a unique example of Roman military architecture, but those who knew the truth saw it differently. The fort's walls still pulsed with a subtle luminescence visible only to those who knew where to look, and the air hummed with contained power that made conventional scanning equipment malfunction. Claire stood at the entrance, watching as a team of specially selected researchers, all bearing certain bloodlines, all carrying marks similar to Serena's, cataloged and studied the site. The Italian government had been surprisingly cooperative once Gianluca revealed certain ancient documents from Vatican archives that spoke of other such sites across the former Roman Empire. "The patterns are holding steady," Elliot reported, checking his modified monitoring equipment. After their experience, he'd developed new tools specifically designed to track the energies contained within the fort. "The binding is actually growing stronger as time passes. It's like the fort is learning, adapting, becoming better at its purpose." Serena emerged from the inner chamber, her role now formalized as the site's primary guardian. The markings on her skin had faded to silvery patterns that seemed to shift in certain lights, and her eyes held a depth of knowledge that spoke of both human and inhuman understanding. "We found another chamber," she said, joining them at the entrance. "Deeper than the others. It contains records of other sites, other bindings. The Romans. They didn't just build an empire of stone and law. They created a network of power points across their territories, each one containing something ancient, something that they both feared and needed." Marco, who had stayed on as head of site security, approached with a tablet displaying satellite imagery. "The Vatican's archives were right. We've identified similar energy signatures at sites across Europe and North Africa. They're all connected, all part of the same vast containment system, and all waiting to be rediscovered," Gianluca added, looking up from a translation he was working on. "The Romans knew they wouldn't last forever. They built these sites to endure, but they also knew that someday, someone would have to understand them again." He glanced at Serena. "That's why the bloodlines were so important. They weren't just creating prisons, they were creating guardians." Claire watched as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the transformed fort. In those shadows, she sometimes thought she could see movement, hints of the vast powers contained within the ancient walls. But now the sight filled her with a strange mix of awe and purpose rather than fear. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," she said, turning to her team. "These sites have been dormant for centuries, their purposes forgotten. We need to find them all, reactivate them, understand what the Romans were really protecting us from." "And what they were protecting," Serena added softly. Her hand traced one of the marks on her arm, which glowed faintly at her touch. "These entities, they're not just dangers to be contained. They're part of the world's foundation, powers that existed before humanity took its first steps. The Romans didn't just bind them, they created a balance, one we need to maintain." As night fell fully, the fort's subtle illumination became more visible, pulsing in rhythm with energies older than civilization itself. Deep within its transformed chambers, ancient powers continued their eternal struggle against bonds that grew stronger with each passing day. The horror they had discovered remained contained, but not forgotten, never forgotten again. Serena stood at the fort's entrance, her role as guardian now eternally bound to the site and its secrets. The blood remembered, passing down through generations the knowledge and power needed to maintain the ancient bargain. And in her dreams, she still heard whispers of things that had existed before time itself. But now those whispers held not just threats, but warnings, teachings, and the weight of a responsibility passed down through millennia. The world outside continued unchanged, unaware of the powers that slumbered in forgotten Roman ruins. But within the transformed fort, a new chapter had begun. The ancient bargain had been renewed, the seals strengthened, and a new generation of guardians had taken up their ancestral duty. As Serena looked out over the darkened excavation site, she saw not just a Roman fort, but a link in a chain that stretched across time itself. A chain that bound together past and present, human and inhuman, power and purpose. The horror they had discovered would remain contained, but its presence would serve as an eternal reminder of the mysteries that still lurked in the shadows of history, waiting to be rediscovered, understood, and bound anew. The end. Though in truth, it was just another beginning in a cycle as old as civilization itself.